Thank you. I just want to start with a little disclaimer. This is a post-lunch session, so I do understand, and some of you might have just arrived yesterday, so you may be still a bit tired. I am not going to require the entire 45 minutes, I suppose. What I'm going to also present to you is work in progress, which is the introduction to the section, which Professor Kusakabe and I are expected to write once all the chapters are submitted. But since we do not have all the chapters with us yet, I have just started putting together a skeleton and started by summarizing what is coming across from the submissions we already have. And what I want to do today is share with you what I have put together. And what I would definitely like to welcome is comments and contributions and feedback from the authors who are here. And it would really be helpful if you could tell me, point out areas which you think need to be highlighted, which are currently getting lost, because each of the papers is, I mean, it's a bhandar of a whole wealth of knowledge about how school systems are structured in each of these countries, with a lot of references, some of them with a lot of footnotes. So it has been a bit of a challenge to summarize, so I've made an attempt, so would really appreciate the authors to point specifically what I might have missed out or what I might have interpreted perhaps incorrectly. And then from the editors-in-chief who are here and from the rest of the participants, what I would really appreciate is you coming up with more questions, because what I realize is that in the process of listening to your questions, some of what the chapter writers have put down might need further refinement. We might realize through this process of questions and answers that we have left out on certain things, and since this work is still in progress, it might help us to improve our respective chapters. So in that spirit, I want to just start with a bit of an introduction to what the section is about. The section is called School Education Systems and Policies. And what it tries to do is it tries to explain the school systems and policies. So it is really an explanatory piece. Looking at each one of it is an explanatory piece, sometimes heavily descriptive, but trying to look at and borrow from the material that has already been published in this field. So no new research has been undertaken. And it focuses on the education structure and the policies in contemporary period. I mean, we are looking, each of the chapters has looked a little bit at the history, but we have primarily focused on looking at how is the structure instituted at this point of time and what are the policies that are prevailing within each of the countries. This particular section is also organized country-wise, as Professor Rekha Pappu started off today by saying some of these are systems and policies are really looking at each of the countries, while the others are thematic sections. This section looks at each country, which means that we have chapters from each of the country contributors, which in a way provide us a picture about how the education system is structured and what are the prevailing policies. So we have the list of the countries that are to be a part of this section, and the ones that are highlighted are at a pretty advanced stage, in a sense that these are the country case studies which have reached or are about to be with the editors-in-chief for one final round of review. So they are pretty much at an advanced stage. The rest of the countries, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Nepal, and Pakistan, are in the process of getting written up. And we have not yet had an opportunity to look at any of the drafts. And so what I'm going to present today is not going to be referring, unfortunately, to any of these 4 countries. It will focus on what has been submitted to us by 6 country contributors. What I have done is I have tried to put together what is coming out strongly as in the context within which each of these countries is located, and try to see where we can look at some kind of comparative insights. So what I'm going to be doing in the next perhaps 20 to 30 minutes is walking you through the contexts and sharing with you some of the insights which I have gleaned by reviewing these 6 country chapters. And to do this, I've just put down the points, and I'm just going to read from some of the text that I have put together. As we all know, and this has also come up in a lot of discussions, not just at lunch tables, but also in the first session that we heard, the keynote session, we know that during the past 20 years, there have been massive changes that have taken place in all countries of South Asia, not just in the education sector, but also in the social, political, and economic processes that are unfolding in these countries. And education system in this region is therefore marked by some striking similarities and certain dissimilarities. As in most parts of the developing world, we find, I mean, this is also coming through very clearly in the chapters, in most parts of the developing countries and also in South Asia, we find that access reforms and education for all had dominated the discourse as well as the focus of education systems and policies in the 90s. And today, as in the chapters that this section actually covers, it shows that the discourse as well as the focus of education systems, particularly the school system, has moved to holding schools accountable with a pressure exercise to become efficient and demonstrate quality of schooling through improved learning outcomes. And this comes across very strongly, and I'll come to this in a little more detail as we move on. And therefore, we see that as the 2014 Education for All Monitoring Report, which was titled Teaching and Learning, Achieving Quality for All, that was the beginning which actually started making the distinction between schooling and learning very explicit. And obviously, this distinction was stirred by the debate which Hanushek and Wersman in 2008 had started by sharing some of their econometric analysis, which argued that quality is central to education if education has to be seen as an investment in a new way of looking at the human capital theory. And thereafter, Breton in 2011, in his paper, which was titled The Quality versus the Quantity of Schooling, What Drives Economic Growth, had argued that there is a clear separation cannot be made between quality and attainment, since there is an element of quality in the systems that have raised education attainment in the first place. So this global discourse on quality, efficiency, and measurements sits within this larger project of global education industry, which is again a new term, the GEI. It also has an acronym, GEI, the Global Education Industry, which one finds unfolding in all these South Asian countries. Lubinsky, Steiner, Kamsi, and Verger in 2006 defined the global education industry as increasingly globalized economic sector in which a broad range of educational services and goods are produced, exchanged, and consumed, often for a for-profit basis. And such actors, as some of the chapters also demonstrate, are embedded in policy making, delivery, as well as marketing. Noah and Yeru Marshall in 2003 described how the motivations for comparing education systems moved. I mean, what we are undertaking in this process is we are comparing different education systems. And here, some of the literature on comparative education, especially Noah, Yeru Marshall in 2003, actually showed this evolution of how we start looking at comparative education. And it has really evolved, they say, from understanding the other, which was the case after the First World War, to constructing the other when there were plans being made by the development agencies under the various programs that were rolled out in developing countries, to a scenario which is measuring the other, from understanding the other, constructing the other, to measuring the other, where student assessments, international student assessments, have served the key starting point, to now a scenario where it is prescribing the other, where there are prescriptions, policy prescriptions being made. And this I thought was interesting, although I do not think, I'm not at this juncture clear whether any of, after the chapters come in, whether we will be able to use this lens to examine from a comparative angle, but I thought this might be something useful to look at. Now, sustainable development goals have also been a part of the global education policies, and each of the chapters actually brought that out very clearly. And this could be because of various causes, and they could be because our countries in South Asia have similar problems, so we inadvertently come up with similar solutions, or it could just be that we have been subjected to certain norms and regulations at an international, coming through conditionalities from the international aids that we have received, or it could be because we have tried to harmonize our policies with the international norms, or there could be just certain level of transnational communication and policy learning that has taken place, like in such fora. But although in comparative education literature, there has always been a search for what works, as the chapters in this section will show, there are difficulties comparing education systems, even at the normative level. Besides, actually, the obvious difficulty comparing countries like Maldives with, I think, just 345 schools to India with 1.5 million schools. So there would be these difficulties as well, besides the normative difficulties. Now, moving on, and I think I have, okay, now I'll start with looking at some of the points that I have pulled out as far as the contexts of these countries go. So the first similarity I find is that, in fact, a number of chapters, colonial legacy has been dealt with very strongly in the chapters coming in from contributions from India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, have discussed the role of colonial legacy in shaping the education systems and what it has meant at the time of independence when governments inherited colonial education systems. In the case of Myanmar, Tanaka and Kain point how in the colonial era, there was dissatisfaction with the discriminatory education system, and later on transition of the education from the military regime to the current administration of headed by Thein Sein. In the case of Bangladesh, Moshmi and Kusakabe show how the purpose of education under British rule was to create an elite class that could help in administration for the government, and this is a shared history that we have, and the presence of English educated elite that have helped in such an, that would help in such an enterprise. Atarupani and Little, who have written on Sri Lanka, have described how the colonial system saw the beginning of fragmentation of schools on the lines of medium of instruction, financial control, religion, and social background of students in Sri Lanka. In the case of Mauritius, Samuel and Mariae discussed the mix of Eastern and Western heritages, the Asian and the African cultural, political, historical, and institutional connections, and how, I quote, contestation among successive colonizers shaped the choices and compromises reached with regard to many elements of the island's identity and its legal, administrative, cultural, and education systems. The second contextual parameter that comes out is that of language. And in Bangladesh, language has played a key role, and after its independence from Pakistan, the chapter discusses how the abolition of English and Urdu was sought while insisting on the use of Bangla as a medium of instruction. And the diversity of languages in schools has been a key concern in India, and even in the case of Myanmar, which has a large number of languages with 135 minority groups throwing up issues on the medium of instructions and issues of inclusion. The third issue has been, which our friends from Maldives have raised in the earlier session, has been that of issues of small island developing states. And this section actually has dealt with the status of schooling systems in two small island developing states, Mauritius and Maldives. And as Rondaji Bias and Ahmed Maniku show in their case of Maldives, issues of scattered island geography and natural disasters like tsunami have had an impact on the education system. When it comes to political scenario, our contribution, the chapter from Sri Lanka shows that after a 30-year civil war between the late 70s to the 90s, completely marred the social and economic development. And the changes, again, in the case of Myanmar, changes in the political system with the transition from the military regime is set to bring transformation. The chapters do show how the political climate has had a strong impact on the education systems. And finally, the comprehensive reforms. In fact, it was quite startling to see how countries like Myanmar, for example, have initiated the process of bringing about comprehensive reforms to be completed only in 2028. And also in the case of India, as we know, the new education policy is currently being drafted and currently being reviewed for finalization. So contextually, I was able to cull out these 5 broad areas which could be of interest. But as I said, this is work in progress, and I would really like to invite each of the country authors also to highlight any specific contextual issue which you think also has a bearing. And perhaps this will become clearer after we listen to the country case studies that is scheduled for tomorrow morning session. Some of these will come out a little more sharply. And then I pulled out certain insights. Now here, let me just mention that when we opened the section out for inviting contributions, we had prepared a loose structure. And we had invited authors to write using that loose structures, but each of the authors was obviously free to dwell upon a particular section if they felt that was a lot more necessary than the others. And so in some sense, we do have these 10 areas which are coming across a lot more in all these 6 contributions so far. And when we have the remaining 4 contributions, we will be able to see certain additional things. I also wanted to say here that I have not had an opportunity to discuss any of these with Professor Kusakabe, who has been, I think, in the middle of travel. So this is also likely to get revised considerably. In terms of insight, one of the key areas that has come out is a striking similarity is that the goals of EFA and of expanding access seems to have been achieved. And there is almost universal primary education and gender parity, and comes out very strongly in the studies from Bangladesh, India, and of course also from Maldives, as was mentioned earlier. However, the problem of dropouts, especially among girls, at secondary level exists. In Myanmar, secondary education is still an issue. What is also coming to fore is that education of those belonging to the marginalized groups, especially the street children, children with disabilities, first-generation schoolgoers, those residing in slums, indigenous communities, is marginalized, raising questions of social inequities, as has been done in the chapters from India as well as Bangladesh, and geographical inequities, as has been demonstrated in the case of Maldives. There is also a very strong mention in each of the country cases, about the diversification of schools. And there is a complex mix of schools in all the countries in the region, especially coming out strongly in India, Bangladesh, for example, where schools were set up by the government, private sector, non-profits, religious groups, communities, with as many as 25 types of schools listed in the case of Bangladesh. In the case of Mauritius, schooling typologies actually have reflected the social diversity and how there is actually an overlap amongst schools as they borrow and share operational practices amongst the different typologies of schools. And at another level, the chapters have shown that how education priority zones that have got created, only a few children are able to break the barriers, coupled with a dual system of branching out of school children into the vocational education stream. similar to the Dhaswaru and the Business Technology Education Council curriculum in the Maldives, which is actually an alternative education pathway offering vocational and technical stream to those who are at a lower secondary grades, and is actually seen as inferior programs. And even in the, I mean, taking this further, the diversification of schools further, even in Maldives with only 375 schools, if I gather right, there are 4 types of schools, different typologies. Now, these diversities have actually, the chapters show that they have created parallel streams of education, catering to different classes, different philosophies and approaches, with little chance for horizontal movement, as Bangladesh case study, Bangladesh chapter very clearly shows. And in the case of Mauritius, there have been problems with its shadow education, along with the challenges faced by the government in regulating the shadow educational system. Thus, diversification and education privatization, as we all know, has been a global trend, but the processes are different across contexts. Some of these variations are a result of historical PPPs with aided schools seen in several countries, and some of it has been privatization via low fee paying schools, as in the case of India. The third area is the exam-orientedness or exam orientation. I mean, what was remarkable is that the chapters show how education systems are now gearing towards focusing on exams. Grades, in the case of Bangladesh, grades 5, 8, 10, 12 have examinations with reforms at the secondary level. And the problem of rote learning and reforms are evident in Myanmar, also in India. Myanmar very clearly articulates merit promotion and social promotion, the move from merit promotion to social promotion to back to merit promotion. And in Mauritius, the chapter discusses how the colonial influence of the exit exams have controlled the chances of success, and how language, culture, and curriculum have contributed to social exclusion. In Sri Lanka, the grade 5 scholarship exams have come under a lot of criticism due to the distortion in primary school curriculum from as early as grade 3, because there is a grade 5 scholarship exam. While those underlining the importance of these grade 5 scholarship exams have said that this is the only way of gaining access in the most popular national schools for secondary education. This is the only way one can gain access to this. Then there is related to the exam orientation is the focus on learning outcomes. This has also come across very clearly and is shown in India, Mauritius, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, where there is an attempt to move away from rote learning, as I mentioned earlier. And besides the academic competency, the focus on 21st century skills, socio-emotional skills involving problem solving, creativity, active learning is evident in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. While if we look at the national curriculum framework of Myanmar 2015 and in the Maldives has outcomes-based curriculum assessments, language and math strongly emphasized for tracking outcomes in the case of Bangladesh. The fifth area again is that of language. The chapter on Maldives discusses how the dual system evolved with English medium schools in Malé and Divehi medium schools in atolls earlier, and how the disparities continue in terms of human and material resources as well as the years of completion of education, schools in Malé and schools in atolls. On the other hand, in Mauritius, the use of KM language, actually I didn't get the full form of KM, it is KM, and I noticed that I have not said what is the full form of that in the chapter now. Use the KM language drawing from African, European, and Asian heritage is discussed along with the debates on language to be used in formal education, and the chapter also discusses the political contestations around the same. In Bangladesh, the growth of English as a language of elite, its acceptance in global economy is discussed, especially in the context of export-oriented sectors, and there was a little bit of discussion earlier about manufacturing and so on, and in the context of Bangladesh, this has been discussed in light of its export-oriented sectors, primarily the garment sector, resulting in the pressure on the government to focus on opening English schools. Then it's the teachers. And although there is an entire section devoted to teachers, and I see there is a lot of scope to build cross-referencing between this particular section in school systems with the section on teachers. The problem of actually limited human resources as well as lack of trained teachers is discussed. In fact, this comes across very strongly in the case of Maldives, where interestingly, the teacher shortage in Maldives is made up by teachers from Sri Lanka, right? And the chapter on Sri Lanka highlights the problem of shortage of teachers in Sri Lanka itself for math, science, and English. Interestingly, the school-based teacher development program of Sri Lanka is shown to empower schools to identify teacher development needs and implement measures to improve their performance. And the sudden, in Myanmar, interestingly, the sudden growth of students and pressures on the availability of teachers led for the appointment of daily waged teachers at primary level, including teachers with less than adequate training. And the chapter also talks about feminization of workforce, lower salaries, and that teaching is not a sought-after profession in Myanmar, similar to many parts of India as well, although that is not coming out clearly in the chapter on India, which I realized. Then with regards to administration of schools, the government is still a main provider of primary schools, with aided schools actually predominating, dominating strongly at the secondary level, in the case of India as well as Bangladesh. In the case of Bangladesh, there is also a strong presence of private, as well as India, strong presence of locally administered schools through district and municipalities. And we have a lot of discussion on that as well in the chapters. And in Mauritius, at the level of community wards. The chapters have actually shown that there have been policy shifts, trying to really find the golden balance point between centralization and decentralization. And this is coming out in the chapters. In the case of Bangladesh, for example, there was provincialization of education, then nationalization, and then decentralization to again centralization. And this question of centralization, decentralization also is critical in the context of India. There has been centralization in Myanmar, while in Sri Lanka and India, we do have decentralization, and the chapters do dwell a lot more into each of these. And administration of schools also includes regulation of schools, and we do have chapters talking about how the government still has the power to grant approval to non-state schools, and this has been described more clearly in Bangladesh and the Indian contexts. In terms of constitutional and legal provisions, I think that is one area which I find in each of the South Asian countries, we have found that there has been very strong and robust constitutional and legal provisions with regards to education. In Bangladesh, which is seen as a basic part of basic necessity of life, and therefore the government's mandate to provide basic education to all its citizens. In Maldives, again, the constitution prescribes that everyone has a right to education without discrimination, similarly to the Indian constitution, which provides a fundamental right, which is a justiciable right. And in addition, chapters have also talked about legislation guaranteeing free and compulsory education in the case of Myanmar as well as India. And the new national education law of Myanmar, and also a few new laws that are being drafted. So some of these policy norms are in a way in a state of getting made. They are in a state of flux. There are new legislations, new policy documents are in the process of getting made. In terms of financial allocations, the chapters show that financial allocations have been less than adequate in the South Asian context, something that came up in the discussion earlier as well. Little over 2% of the GDP was earmarked to education in Bangladesh, which relies heavily on the private sector. India has not been able to reach the target of 6% of GDP. Myanmar also spends less than its neighboring countries, though allocations have been rapidly increasing by 20 to 30% every year in the case of Myanmar. And in Mauritius, because of the smaller economic base, 12 to 13% of the national education is used for education. But I think, again, this will allow us to look at cross-references with the chapter on the political economy of education. That particular section will also get into the details of some of these questions of financial allocations. And finally, the role and the rise of international aid, grants and loans from international financial institutions as well as bilaterals. The chapters really talk about this, starting from the international agencies playing a policy-making role, as in the case of Bangladesh, and through conditionalities and related changes in the case of India. The provision of funds plus technical assistance in the context of Myanmar. In Mauritius, the chapter talks about how the policy construction of these bodies was challenged before making it relevant to the indigenously connected resources. And the challenges in Maldives are different because it has transitioned to becoming a middle income group country, resulting in a decline of foreign aid. And Sri Lanka has also been receiving foreign aid and loans for education sector since the 50s. And in the 90s, the large-scale support has allowed it to have programs similar to that that we witnessed in India. So this is more or less what I have managed to put together, looking at the 6 chapters that have come in. And as I said, each chapter is a bhandar. It is so full of information and insights. And I realized after just a few readings of it, I'm still just trying to understand. It's different in the context of India, where if I read something, I understand it quickly, but it requires me to get into, imagine Maldives, the context, and then read what Rhonda and Maniko have written. So it's something, I think, which is a long process, and I have hence shared with you some of the preliminary work that has started by putting things together. So really welcome comments, feedback, and would also invite, if there are specific questions on countries, for some of the country contributors to actually speak up, or wait for tomorrow to hear the longer version of their presentations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Archana. Questions? We have 5 minutes, so if anybody would like to ask a quick question, we can accommodate that. And otherwise, we'll save them for coffee or tomorrow. I don't know if this is
Things work. Archana, I was wondering if the question of privatization or private presence in these countries has come up as a theme, and also the presence and work of civil society organizations as players in shaping not just the access to school, but as larger players in shaping policy or other areas of school education. And what about regional differences within countries? Is that an issue that comes up, or is it something that is?
Yeah, then I can, in the interest of time.
Yeah, so I wanted to know about policy borrowing. You did mention in passing that it could be learned, etc. But I wanted to know if the chapters talk, or you as a series editor is looking at policy borrowing more closely.
Any other questions? If not, go ahead.
Okay, so
I'm so sorry, 1 minute.
Just information, you mentioned in relation to Myanmar that there was merit promotion and then social promotion back to merit promotion. So I didn't quite understand those terms.
So it's similar to detention, no detention, detention in the Indian parlance. Yeah. Yeah. This is a new language. I also, yeah.
Hello. Yeah, so my question is related to the exam orientation and learning outcomes. You have just pointed out the insight. So I want to know are there any booming of coaching centers in South Asian countries to target only STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? So are there any policy which are regulating this coaching centers, how they're working along with the schools in Asian countries?
Yeah. Yeah. So, can I just? So, Padma, the privatization is definitely coming out in all the chapters, and the role of private sector in as a provider of schooling. We do not have as much in the chapters on how private influence and private involvement is operating at the level of provision of other services and so on. That is not coming across strongly, but in terms of looking at the numbers, increasing numbers of schools from the private, we do have that. And it would, and in fact, very detailed distribution also provided. So perhaps when we put together the section introduction, we'll be able to draw a lot more nuanced observations on that. On civil society, I did not come across much. But again, we still have 4 more chapters to come, so there might be something that is likely to come across in terms of civil society participation in education. But we do have community schools, we do have grant-in-aid schools coming up, but civil society overall as such, I do not think has got adequate mention. In terms of policy borrowing, this is what I was looking at when I was looking at the South Asian countries and the phase at which they were. We've all passed the access reforms. We are now all talking about efficiency and quality. These were some of the questions I had. I mean, I still think we'll need to, when all the chapters come together, I have to actually see what was the timing at which these things actually came in. Are all these countries really talking about learning outcomes because of the TIMSS and the PISA? Are we all going through the same crisis at a similar time, and hence coming up with our orientation, which is exam focused, or is it something that is coming from a lot bigger global discourse? So that is, right now I'm a bit ambivalent, and I'm not able to say. It could be either or so, because I'm not sure whether the chapters clearly point out, and we might need to do some additional work and referencing ourselves to be able to make such a proposition. In the case of coaching centers, as I said, it has come across not in all the country contexts, but it is something which is an area where state has regulated in one case, but there hasn't been a mention about this in all the countries. STEM focus again is not coming out strongly, the need to, and I have not here talked about all. ICT in education, for example, is being talked about in the context of Sri Lanka, and I think in the context of Mauritius also. We didn't talk about it in the Indian context, and so I think, although we have ourselves done a lot of work, but I see therefore there is somewhere lack of uniformity, and I was not too worried about it. But for the purposes of culling together a summary, some of these got mixed out. But just because another country has not mentioned it, I would not say it is not there. This is really based on what chapters have come in so far, and the summary is reflective of that.
Archana, sorry, I had a question. I was wondering if the chapters because these are country-specific chapters, whether there's mention of figures and individuals who have influenced thinking on education for each of the countries, because we hardly get any names. So
names, I do not think. Let me go back and see whether I can find names. But figures we do have. But it might be good when we have tomorrow's discussions to bring some of these questions. Yes. Because I do not think in the chapter on India we mentioned J.P. Naik, now looking back, or even Ambedkar. So some of these things perhaps have got lost out, but if we think, we could just bring these up.
So let's thank Archana.
Thank you.